I'm sure we've all played games, especially online and RPG games, that feel fresh and fun on the first playthrough and maybe even for a short while in the so-called endgame, but ultimately because of certain key flaws in its design, falls short in its replayability and longevity. And on the other hand, we also have certain classics that players often find themselves wanting to return to every once in a while, even after binging it for weeks or say even months. So is Diablo IV going to be such a game? Will it be able to perhaps endure the test of time as Diablo II has? As Blizzard's newest flagship game, they have said that they're gonna be supporting it for many years down the line. But I think that whether or not it'll truly be played and remembered as one of the greats will largely depend on the foundational, especially endgame systems on which the game is built. So stay a while and listen as we take a magnifying glass to everything we know so far about Diablo 4's endgame systems and activities, and even how they have perhaps been inspired by other games and whether those systems have been successful in those games. Now, before we dive into and scrutinize the various endgame systems, it is crucial to first acknowledge the broader context of these systems in terms of how long each season will last, as these endgame gameplay loops really only need to last as long as and be engaging for the duration of one so-called season, of which Blizzard has stated that there should be about 4 a year, and assuming that they have roughly equal lengths, that should be about 3 months per season. Having seasons lasting a few months where players can start new characters, tackle seasonal achievements and challenges, as well as leaderboards is not new to the Diablo franchise, dating back to Diablo 2's latter seasons, and which Diablo 3 has also iterated upon. And for Diablo 4, the developers have also said that each new season will introduce gameplay-altering mechanics and content to keep the game feeling fresh in some way. This is reminiscent of how seasons are handled in Path of Exile, where each new season introduces completely new mechanics, challenges, and ways to obtain better and unique loot. And this is also somewhat true of Diablo 3, but to a lesser extent. Therefore, what we can expect from Diablo 4 is a more so-called live service format with constant updates and different ways to play, and players sort of soft resetting, at least in terms of decking out their characters and chasing endgame progression every few months, right? And it is with this lens that we are diving into Diablo 4's endgame systems and activities. And aside from the aforementioned seasonal features and updates, I'd also like to highlight that Blizzard has stated that with Diablo 4, each season journey will likely culminate in a challenging boss to defeat, which is, in my opinion, a more fun departure from Diablo 3's season journey, wherein players tackle a series of achievements very much centered around using greater rifts as a benchmark for progress. Although Diablo 4 does have nightmare dungeons, which I'll go into more depth about later. I do think that working towards defeating a boss, which theoretically involves not only gearing and powering up, but also learning the boss's mechanics, feels much more rewarding, especially when compared to just being able to clear, say, Diablo 3's greater rifts with good enough gear with little skill involved. And this is actually something Path of Exile does somewhat to decent success, if not great success, using various bosses almost as benchmarks for players to test their power and skill. So with that, each season journey will likely feature a different boss and or challenge to beat, which should help keep things fresh. And also, possibly along with each season's battle pass, there could also be things like seasonal achievements for players to chase, similar to Diablo 3 seasons. Or perhaps the battle pass can simply be leveled up by doing any sorts of activities you want. But I guess only time will tell. Speaking of which, achievements themselves are indeed confirmed for the game, and can provide rewards such as titles, again similar to Diablo 3, as well as other Blizzard titles like World of Warcraft. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these have to be tied to seasonal content, as they could just be yet another set of objectives that some, perhaps completionist type players may like to seek out. Next, another layer of progression and benchmarking, so to speak, is world tiers, which are very similar to the different levels of game difficulty we've been familiar with in all the older Diablo games. The aforementioned final boss of each season is actually unlocked with the highest difficulty, Torment, designed for max level characters and featuring the best drops, experience bonus, and greatest resistance reduction of your character. And below that difficulty or world tier are Hell, Nightmare, Veteran, and Adventurer tiers, with of course each subsequent difficulty unlocking various bonuses, and it's very worth noting that Nightmare difficulty unlocks the chance for Nightmare Sigils, which unseal the more difficult than usual Nightmare dungeons, and this difficulty is meant to be started roughly after one clears the campaign. Moving on, Diablo 4's open world across 5 zones, or even more if we count locations like Hell, will undoubtedly be filled with plenty of side quests, treasures, and other fun discoverables. And I even have a slight suspicion that developers may have taken some inspiration for this from The Witcher 3, which is a game that does this extremely well in my opinion, with a huge immersive open world, and which is also traversed by a horseback, just like in Diablo 4, filled with fun lore and rewards to hunt down for dozens of hours. Now, one legitimate concern with having a static open world, and Diablo 4's is just that, as large as it may be, is the lack of replayability, in that once players have done and discovered everything there is out there, even if there is a reward incentive to visit these places, like in a new season for example, it will definitely be less fun to go out of one's way to travel to locations that have already been discovered. But if a game world is also dynamic, meaning that it is not merely unchanging but can have elements of variance via other forms of randomization with things like in-game events, seasonality, and or even updates to the world with new patches and seasons and whatnot, that can make it much more fun, engaging, and immersive. And in terms of this, I'm actually pretty optimistic because Diablo 4, first of all, will feature the innovative, on paper at least, stronghold system with hubs that can be, for example, controlled by hostile demons, but then reclaimed by players and turned into safe havens, some with unique merchants or side quests, and even dungeons that unlock. And next, in the August development blog post from a few months back, the developers also have promised frequent and varied live events, which, if they also provide decent rewards, sound like a very welcome and fun addition. Now, one of the primary ways that Blizzard is incentivizing exploration of Diablo 4's open world is with the Renown System. Now, if you've played the latest World of Warcraft expansion, Dragonflight, and even by extension the previous expansion, Shadowlands, you'll find that it also features its own so-called Renown System, but is not without some similarities to Diablo 4's Renown System. This essentially involves building up points or reputation with each of the 5 zones of Sanctuary, with each renowned milestone unlocking account-wide benefits for each of your characters. Apparently, you can even progress this with your entire account, with any character of your choosing contributing to different parts of your renown, so to speak. And so I'm glad that this is actually different from World of Warcraft's version of it, where each character actually has their separate renown levels with the different factions in the game, although both systems are still similar in that many renown rewards in WoW are also account-wide. With Diablo 4's version, I actually like the idea much more because not only does it, again, incentivize exploration and doing the various activities the game offers like side quests and strongholds, but also allows players to set up their alternate characters better by allowing them to become more powerful and be able to level faster just by progressing on your main character. And on the flip side, what I also especially like is that this system allows playing your alt characters to even contribute to power on your main character as well, which can then make players who have typically liked to focus on playing just one character during each ladder season of, say, the past Diablo games to have more of a reason to also play other characters as well, simultaneously perhaps in Diablo 4. And even as an extension to this, during your journeys around Sanctuary, you'll also be able to find so-called Altars of Lilith, which not only also contribute to renown points, but also give all of your characters a stat boost, which I think is yet another fun way to incentivize exploration and playing new characters. For example, by leveling them up through different zones. Next, we have the Whispers of the Dead, which on paper, I'm not so sure that I feel particularly excited about it, given my experience with bounties in Diablo 3 and world quests in World of Warcraft, which seem to be the main sources of inspiration. In fact, the Whisper system sounds just like world quests, which are timed objectives that show up on your world map that not only you can complete for rewards, but also contribute to a larger reward if you knock out enough of these for a turn-in. But of course, for Diablo 4, there's a different naming convention. So instead of doing world quests or bounties, you'll be doing these so-called whispers that are scattered throughout Sanctuary, which you can get experience and gold and also grim favors for. And by accumulating these so-called grim favors, by getting 10 actually, you can then exchange them at the Tree of Whispers for some additional rewards. And the reason I'm personally not hyped for the Whisper system is that it feels more like a way to give players a reason to log on frequently to boost, say, engagement metrics, since it sort of sounds like these whispers are on a timer and can thus expire and refresh, right? And can thus incite a fear of missing out, especially with min-maxing players and those who want to be the most competitive on, say, the ladder. If WoW's world quests and by extension Diablo 3's bounties, which are the precursor to even that, are any indication, save for a few interesting quests like free-for-all PvP quests or quests with unique mechanics, they largely served more as a quick, largely mindless activity for players to check out their to-do lists. And on to Helltides, which are yet another Diablo 4 endgame activity that seems to have been derived from World of Warcraft. More specifically, it's assaults and invasions, wherein a usually random zone will be attacked, so to speak, by a group or faction and will feature unique quests, world quests, and or even world bosses. However, unlike with Whispers of the Dead, in theory anyway, Helltides gives this formula an interesting twist by not only making it so that the monsters and encounters will be more difficult than what is usual in the zone, but players will also need to focus on survival, as dying will actually cause you to lose the valuable currency called cinders used to purchase gear, and that drops from these Helltide events. I believe this will add another angle of fun, as players cannot just focus on maximizing their damage and, say, farming as efficiently as possible, and would actually need to tailor their builds and playstyle to not dying. And next, onto world bosses, which Blizzard seems to have been trying to hype players up about and talk quite frequently about. And I do really want to like world bosses, and I think they were in fact viewed more favorably back in the old days of, say, World of Warcraft, when they were actually somewhat challenging and required coordinated groups to take down. But I fear that these bosses in Diablo 4 will end up in a similar place as they currently exist in WoW, which are another easy and efficient yet unengaging weekly task to check off one's to-do list, but I would love to be proven wrong. I just think that world bosses are generally just difficult to tune, because if they're too challenging, they might not be accessible enough by Blizzard's terms. Whereas if they're easy, and I think that, Blizzard and developers generally want to err towards accessibility, then many players will be able to experience them and reap their rewards. However, that'll just make them feel more like a chore perhaps. By the way, so far, 3 world bosses have been announced, but only 2, Ashava and the Treasure Beast, have actually been revealed. Now, next up, Nightmare Dungeons is a feature I'm quite excited about, and I really hope Blizzard does it right. And they are essentially a way for players to add special modifiers to a dungeon to not only make them more difficult and varied, but also be able to provide higher rarity rewards. The idea for it likely not only stemmed from Diablo 3's Greater Rifts, but also, and probably more so, from World of Warcraft's Mythic Plus dungeons, which were introduced back during its Legion expansion and has been very well received and a welcome addition to that game as an alternative endgame progression activity alongside raiding and player versus player. And as for Diablo 4's iteration of this feature, Nightmare Dungeons look to be the primary way that players, including and especially the most hardcore, are going to be pushing the boundaries of character power, min-maxing, and competing for the top spots of each seasonal ladder. They are essentially like Greater Rifts, but likely better in that one can actually modify Nightmare Dungeons for increased and better loot, higher difficulty, and straight up different types of challenges, each of which hopefully involves a fun learning curve or skill ceiling similar to Mythic Plus dungeons. For example, certain modifiers can make monsters in a dungeon behave completely differently and or have completely new mechanics requiring players to adapt or choose different playstyles. And unlike Greater Rifts, which again players can mostly push to higher levels by merely acquiring better gear, Mythic Plus dungeons, and hopefully by extension Nightmare dungeons should definitely allow for more satisfying progression that involves not only player power but also player skill by having certain modifiers not simply able to be overcome with just straight up player power alone. For example, if you stand in the fire, you would likely die unless you are way overgeared. And what's more is that with each new season, and this is also how it's done in World of Warcraft, dungeon modifiers can rotate in and out, potentially, and new ones can be added, including seasonal themes. And speaking of dungeons, while Nightmare dungeons are largely for pushing to higher levels of difficulty to obtain better rewards, and for a challenge and for leaderboards, there is yet another system in place called the Codex of Power that incentivizes players to simply complete some of the multitude of dungeons across the world, of which by my last count, there are at least 140 dungeons. So upon first completion of a dungeon, players unlock a so-called legendary aspect specific to that dungeon, which grants a unique legendary power that one can imbue onto gear. Now, these drop at the lowest roll of that legendary affix, so they should be replaced later on, but can still be a great way to either try out new builds, even on different classes, because it does look like the system is also account-wide, or grab filler affixes that you might need for a given build to at least function properly. Now, the systems we've seen that are the most similar to this so far are Kanai's Cube from Diablo 3 and the legendary power affix transfer system in Diablo Immortal. But I do like that Diablo 4 is attaching this to dungeons though, as opposed to being able to extract power strictly just from items themselves, as this provides a guaranteed reward and something to look forward to whenever you explore a new dungeon, which for some reason actually gives me Elder Scrolls Skyrim flashbacks. Now, player versus player, while likely not for everyone, is surely a very welcome addition to the game. I personally really like it, especially considering some players played Diablo 2 even primarily for its PvP. And how it works in Diablo 4 is that the primeval Mephisto has cursed specific areas of Sanctuary, transforming them into deadly fields of hatred, which are designated PvP zones that are proving grounds for players to not only dispatch demons to collect these seeds of hatred, but also kill each other for these seeds that have been collected. And what's more is that to be able to actually make use of these seeds, you actually have to bring them to a specific location, an altar of extraction, to then smash these seeds into red dust, which means you'll have to survive the ordeal, converting the seeds into dust to then be able to use that dust to buy rewards such as cosmetics for PvP feats. Now, the Seeds of Hatred system should add an extra layer of depth to PvP in that players don't just have to think about, say, dueling matchups or team battle matchups, but also how they need to play to actually ensure collecting as many seeds and dust as possible while also not dying, right? This should make for some interesting builds and strategies that, for example, involve distraction, builds that emphasize quickness and or survivability and escape, and or even certain types of team play and compositions. This also reminds me of War Mode in World of Warcraft, which is a feature that has been quite well received and which allows players to opt in or out of PvP as they please, in town though. Similarly, in Diablo 4, players can still exist in the same open world, but those who do not want to PvP can largely steer clear of these fields, right? Or perhaps even sneak in a red dust extraction or two if no one else is around. And last I heard, PvP rewards are also only going to be cosmetic only, meaning those who play are mostly going to be those who actually enjoy PvP or really want those cosmetics. If anything though, one potential concern is balance, which can be much more difficult than if the game only primarily had PvP for its endgame. And this is likely one of the reasons Diablo 3 never saw its originally planned PvP arena system come to fruition, and also probably why Path of Exile doesn't really try to be involved with it either. Then again, Diablo 2 does have a fairly successful PvP system. Now, crafting and gathering are somewhat of a continuation and iteration from Diablo 3 systems and has some new features as well, with gathering of course being one of them. These aren't specifically endgame systems per se, but will likely yet play a big part in both endgame character progression and as activities to do in the endgame. And there are 4 different types of crafters that players will interact with in Diablo 4. The Alchemist, Blacksmith, the Jeweler, and the Occultist. First, the Alchemist allows players to upgrade the healing amount of their health potions, as well as craft beneficial elixirs that can be very helpful for specific dungeons or encounters, such as ones that provide specific elemental resistances. All of these elixirs will also grant an experience boost, which will likely be extremely beneficial as well, since a significant proportion of player power is going to be dictated by level and things like Paragon boards, and not just gear. Kind of similar to Diablo 2, where gear isn't as much of a character's power compared to Diablo 3. The Alchemist also allows players to create instances, but it's not yet clear what those are going to do just yet. Also, all the items you craft and upgrade at the Alchemist seem to require reagents that you gather from around Sanctuary as well, which officially adds gathering resources like herbs an activity in a Diablo game, which I currently have mixed feelings about, but I guess we'll see. Next, the Blacksmith makes a return as the NPC you go to salvage unwanted gear for useful parts, so to speak. And one addition to the Blacksmith for Diablo 4 is the ability to upgrade gear to increase the weapon's damage or the armor value / power of a piece of armor. The Jeweler will allow players to craft jewelry, which are likely rings and amulets, but that feature hasn't yet been officially revealed. However, we do know that players will be able to craft and upgrade socketable gems here as well, similar to before, with each gem type's offerings looking more balanced this time around, at least on paper, which means the Emerald isn't just going to be extremely dominant like in Diablo 3. And last but certainly not least, the Occultist is a new addition that serves several purposes. Rerolling attributes on gear like Diablo 3's Mystic, plus imbuing legendary aspects onto rare and legendary items, as well as, very importantly, crafting Nightmare Sigils to customize and upgrade your Nightmare dungeons. Now, most of these crafting features will also involve gold costs, and are thus a primary gold sink. I don't, however, foresee gold fighting specializations to be a thing though, like in Diablo 2, as it still seems like gold serves more of a secondary purpose rather than being a possible primary avenue for gaining gear or wealth like with Diablo 2 with its gold gambling system. However, since there will be some form of limited trading, gold might be useful for that as well, though I really don't anticipate it'll be too important. Speaking of trading, what I and I'm sure many players enjoyed about Diablo 2 and games like Path of Exile is the ability to trade items openly, which is not going to be possible in Diablo 4, at least for most items. And what made that sort of system fun and engaging in my opinion as a huge part of the endgame was that even if you got an item to drop that you couldn't use or didn't need to use, or even if you can use it, you can always have the choice to cash it in or trade for something else, especially if it's a rare and valuable drop, and even one that might not be even usable by your class, right? For example, it's something that's really good for a different class. And this actually also allows for different types of playstyles, such as specifically trying to magic find for the more high level and rare items from more difficult zones in these games, or perhaps farming for more consistent drops and accumulating wealth steadily that way. And so I personally think that without completely open trade in Diablo 4, magic finding and item hunting for the sake of doing so is going to probably feel less exciting. But we'll see how this limited form of trade plays out. And as Diablo 4 is ultimately a new and different game than its predecessors and other ARPGs, I shall give it the benefit of the doubt as well. And lastly, real quick, as for gambling in Diablo 4, it too will be making a return, but items will not be gambled for gold, but instead with a special currency called obols, which can drop from mini events like cursed chests and shrines, local events, and zone-wide events. And these types of events in gambling does seem more secondary rather than a primary way for players to gear up, unlike Diablo 3's Kadala with blood shards from rifts. So what do you think about Diablo 4's endgame? Personally, I think there will be quite a lot to keep us having fun in the endgame, again, in the context of 3 to 4 month long seasons. And one final thing I'd like to add is that I think it's interesting that Diablo 2's endgame manages to be fairly captivating, even without a lot of specific activities to do outside of just farming high level zones and building up characters. And that's because item hunting, with all of their items being tradable, can be quite thrilling in and of itself, right? And I think some would even argue that that is the core of what makes Diablo fun, and will feel like a Diablo game, at least as many of the old timers remember it. And I suppose for now, only time will tell whether Diablo IV made the correct decision to not feature open trade. And with that, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel for more cutting edge guides and videos just like this. Thank you so much for watching, and peace.